I've never been one to believe in urban legends, ghost stories, or any kind of paranormal nonsense. But that night, as I wandered down the deserted streets of Belgrave, something felt undeniably off. The tale of the dancing woman, a chilling figure that stalked the alleys with a slow, hypnotic waltz, had always struck me as a joke. Some viral prank, probably dreamed up by bored teenagers. People claimed to have seen her twirling in the moonlight, her arms outstretched as though she were locked in an eternal dance, swaying to some invisible music. Those who saw her, they said, rarely survived the encounter unscathed. I laughed at the absurdity of it. How could anyone be scared of something so ridiculous? The stories painted her as a deranged woman in a tattered gown, wielding a knife that she would plunge into any passerby unfortunate enough to stumble upon her performance. The most dramatic stories even claimed she wasn't human at all, but a ghost or demon doomed to haunt the streets of Belgrave forever. Yet here I was, standing on the corner of Belgrave Avenue and Crest Street, the very place where the legend supposedly began. The night was colder than I'd anticipated, and the wind carried a biting edge that made me shiver under my jacket. Still, the streets were empty, and there was no sign of the notorious Ksenia, as the locals had named her. My name is Luka Novak, and I'm a journalist. I've made a career out of debunking myths, exposing frauds, and proving once and for all that the things that go bump in the night are nothing more than fiction. What I love most is uncovering the truth behind these so-called urban legends, and naturally, when the story of the dancing woman began gaining traction on social media, I knew I had to check it out. It had started innocently enough random tweets, blurry photos, shaky videos that could barely make out the form of a woman spinning under the streetlights. But as the sightings grew more frequent, so did the rumors. There were whispers of disappearances, of people vanishing after encountering the dancing woman. Yet, despite all the buzz, no one had provided any concrete evidence that the story was real. That's where I came in. Equipped with my trusty camera, notebook, flashlight, and a sense of invincibility, I was determined to spend the night in Belgrave's most notorious alley and put the whole thing to rest. It was nearly midnight when I arrived. The streets were unusually quiet, save for the occasional rustling of leaves or the distant hum of traffic. The few strays I saw darted quickly into the shadows, disappearing like phantoms into the night. The buildings that lined the street were old and dilapidated, their brick facades crumbling from years of neglect. Even though I had been here before, the place felt different tonight. There was a weight in the air, a palpable tension that made my skin crawl. I chalked it up to nerves. I wasn't scared, of course. I didn't believe in any of this. But I'd be lying if I said the stillness didn't unnerve me. Belgrave wasn't a large town, but it had its share of strange stories, most of which were tied to its history. Founded in the late 1800s, the town had been a bustling hub during the Industrial Revolution, but as the factories shut down and the population dwindled, it became a near ghost town. The residents who remained seemed content to live in their own world, isolated from the rest of society. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and gossip was currency. The legend of the dancing woman, however, was newer. No one could agree on when it started, but most said it had been around for at least 50 years. The name Ksenia had been passed down through generations, though no one knew who she was or if she had ever existed. Some believed she had been a factory worker who went mad after losing her family in a fire. Others claimed she was a jilted lover, forever doomed to wander the streets in search of her lost love. None of that mattered to me, though. I was here to prove one thing, that Ksenia was a fabrication, a figment of the collective imagination, and once I did, I'd have another great article to add to my portfolio. The alley where Ksenia had supposedly been seen was just ahead. I glanced at my watch, 11:47 p.m. I had 13 minutes before the clock struck midnight, the hour when Ksenia was said to appear. I set up my camera on a tripod at the entrance of the alley, facing the street lamp that flickered intermittently at its center. The light cast long, jagged shadows that danced across the walls, giving the illusion of movement where there was none. I took a deep breath and began narrating into the camera. We're here on Belgrave Avenue, just a few minutes shy of midnight, in search of the infamous dancing woman. According to local legend, she appears under this very streetlight at the stroke of 12, swaying to some eerie, inaudible melody. So far, we've seen no sign of her. But we'll wait and see if anything happens. I turned off the camera and leaned against the brick wall, my breath forming small clouds in the chilly night air. The wind had picked up, whistling through the narrow alley, and rustling the few remaining leaves clinging to the trees. It was almost peaceful, in a way, the kind of quiet that only comes in the dead of night. But the peace didn't last long. As I stood there, I began to hear something faint, so faint, in fact, that I almost dismissed it as the wind at first. But no, it wasn't the wind, it was music, soft, barely audible, but unmistakable. A slow, haunting melody, like something from an old, scratchy record. It grew louder with each passing second, filling the air with an eerie, melancholic tune. My heart skipped a beat. Could this be part of the legend? Was someone trying to prank me? I reached for my camera, switching it back on and aiming it toward the streetlight. The flickering had stopped now, and the light shone steady and bright. And then, just as the clock struck midnight, I saw her. Ksenia stood beneath the streetlight, her silhouette faint but unmistakable. She was tall and willowy, her body wrapped in a long, flowing gown that fluttered in the breeze. Her hair, dark and wild, framed her pale face, and her arms moved gracefully as she swayed to the haunting melody that now filled the air. My heart pounded in my chest as I watched her. She was real. Or at least something was standing there, moving in the shadows. I raised my camera to film, but my hands were trembling so violently that the lens struggled to focus. I forced myself to take a deep breath, steadying my grip as I zoomed in on her. For a long moment she simply danced, her movements slow and deliberate. Her arms floated through the air, and her gown billowed around her, as if she were performing for an audience I couldn't see. I stood there, mesmerized, unable to tear my eyes away from her. But then, something changed. Her movements grew more erratic, more frantic. Her twirls became sharper, her steps heavier, as if she were no longer dancing for pleasure but out of desperation. And then, without warning, she stopped. Her head snapped in my direction, and I saw her face clearly for the first time. It was pale, almost ghostly white, with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. Her lips were thin and twisted into a cruel smile, and her teeth sharp, jagged, glinted in the moonlight. But it wasn't her face that terrified me the most. It was her eyes. They were black, deep, bottomless pits of darkness that seemed to swallow the light around them. I couldn't move. Her gaze had locked me in place, and no matter how much I wanted to run, my legs wouldn't obey. I felt frozen, paralyzed by her stare, as she began to move toward me, her gown dragging across the ground like a funeral shroud. In her hand, I saw the glint of metal and knife, just as the legends had said. My heart thundered in my chest, and I could hear the blood rushing in my ears as I stumbled backward, my feet barely keeping up with my body. I turned and sprinted down the street, my camera bouncing against my chest as I ran. But no matter how fast I ran, I could hear her behind me, slow, deliberate footsteps that echoed in the stillness of the night, each one getting closer and closer. I risked a glance over my shoulder, and she was still there, moving faster now, her black eyes locked onto mine. Her smile had widened, and her knife gleamed in the dim light as she raised it higher. I didn't stop. I couldn't. My legs burned, and my lungs screamed for air, but I kept running, turning down alley after alley, hoping to lose her in the maze of streets. But no matter where I went, I could hear her behind me, her footsteps never faltering, her presence a constant shadow on my heels. I could see the lights of the main road ahead, the safety of civilization just within reach. But just as I thought I was free, something cold wrapped around my ankle, yanking me off my feet. I hit the ground hard, the impact knocking the wind from my lungs as I scrambled to get up. Before I could move, she was on top of me. Her icy fingers gripped my throat, her face inches from mine as she smiled down at me with those black, soulless eyes. The knife gleamed in her hand, and I knew there was no escape. This was it. I closed my eyes, waiting for the pain, for the final blow, but it never came. When I opened my eyes again, she was gone. The street was empty, the night eerily silent once more. I was lying in the middle of the road, my camera a few feet away, its lens shattered. I sat up, my heart racing as I scanned the area for any sign of her. But there was nothing. Just the empty streets and the flickering streetlights. I stumbled to my feet, my body trembling as I grabbed my camera and hurried back to my car. I didn't look back. I didn't need to. Ksenia was real, and she had let me live. But I knew deep down that I wouldn't be the last. Somewhere in the darkness of Belgrave, she was still dancing, waiting for her next audience. The next morning I awoke in a cold sweat, the memories of the night before still fresh in my mind. I had barely slept, haunted by the image of Ksenia's hollow eyes and that twisted smile. The sun was shining through my blinds, offering a false sense of comfort. Everything felt wrong, like the night before had seeped into my bones, tainting even the light of day. The rational part of my brain still tried to convince me it had all been a nightmare, a twisted product of my overactive imagination, but I knew better. The bruises on my neck, the shattered lens of my camera, and the haunting music that still rang in my ears were proof that what I had witnessed was no dream. I sat on the edge of my bed, gripping my coffee mug like it was a lifeline, staring at my laptop. I had hours of footage to review, and the dread of seeing her face again in high definition made my stomach churn. Despite my fear, I couldn't just abandon the story. I was a journalist. After all, my job was to expose the truth, no matter how terrifying that truth might be. I clicked play. The video started as expected. The empty alley, the flickering streetlight, my voice calm and confident as I introduced the legend of Xenia. I watched myself so oblivious, standing there talking about how none of it was real. Then came the music. My blood ran cold as I heard it again, soft and distant at first, but unmistakable. The camera didn't pick it up clearly, but it was there, lurking in the background like a ghostly hum. And then she appeared. Xenia emerged from the shadows, just as I remembered. She looked even more horrific on camera, her gown tattered and fluttering like it had a life of its own. Her movements were graceful, almost beautiful, but in a way that made my skin crawl. I felt sick watching her, knowing what was coming next. But the footage wasn't what I expected. As she twirled beneath the streetlight, her head snapped toward the camera. Her hollow eyes seemed to lock onto me, even though I was watching through a screen. I shivered. Her smile widened, and she started moving toward the camera toward me. But something was wrong. The screen flickered, distorting her image like old VHS footage. And then, just as she was about to reach the camera, the screen went black. I stared at the empty screen, my heart pounding in my chest. I fast-forwarded, rewound, and played it again. The same thing happened. Just before she reached me, the footage cut out. The rest of the video was nothing but static. I slammed the laptop shut, my hands trembling. The camera had malfunctioned, but I had seen her. I had felt her icy fingers around my throat. That wasn't a technical glitch. That was something else. Something unnatural. I needed answers. I spent the rest of the day researching Xenia, diving deeper into the town's history than I ever had before. The internet was full of the usual urban legend nonsense, claims of ghost sightings, cryptic photos, conspiracy theories about a curse. None of it was helpful. But then in the darkest corners of the web, I found something different. An old article from a Belgrave newspaper, dated over 60 years ago, with a grainy black and white photo of a woman in a flowing dress. She looked just like the woman I had seen last night. The caption read, "Xenia Markov found dead after tragic fire." But I clicked on the article, my heart racing. According to the story, Xenia had been a dancer at a local theater. She was known for her beauty and grace, and her performances drew large crowds. But behind the scenes, her life was far from glamorous. She had been involved in a scandalous affair with Placery owner, a married man with ties to the underworld. When his wife found out about the affair, rumors of a confrontation circulated, and just days later, a fire broke out at the theater. Xenia was among the victims, her body found charred and unrecognizable. The official report stated that the fire was an accident, but many believed otherwise. Some said it was arson, that the factory owner's wife had set the fire in a fit of jealousy. Others claimed it was revenge from the factory owner's business rivals who wanted to make an example of him. But there was one part of the story that sent chills down my spine. The article mentioned that Xenia's body had been found in the alley behind the theater, the same alley where I had seen her last night. Witnesses claimed they had seen her dancing in the flames, twirling and spinning as if unaware of the inferno consuming her. When they tried to pull her to safety, she disappeared into the smoke, only to be found dead hours later. And then there was the knife. According to the article, Xenia had been found clutching a silver knife, an old family heirloom passed down through generations. No one knew why she had it with her, but some speculated it had something to do with her lover's dangerous connections. Others believed she had been using it to defend herself when the fire broke out. I leaned back in my chair, my mind racing. Could it be true? Could Xenia really have been trapped in some sort of limbo, forced to relive her final moments for eternity? I didn't know what to believe anymore. All I knew was that something had followed me home, and it wasn't done with me yet. That night I didn't sleep. Every creak, every rustle, every gust of wind made me jump. I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I kept the lights on, my camera close by, but the unease only grew. Xenia's face haunted my thoughts, her black eyes staring at me from the darkness of my room. The air felt thick, oppressive, as if the walls themselves were closing in on me. And then, just past midnight, I heard it again, the music. It was faint at first, barely a whisper, but it was unmistakable. That same haunting melody from the night before, My heart raced as I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket like it could protect me from what was coming. The music grew louder, filling the room with its eerie, melancholic tune. And then I saw her. Xenia stood at the foot of my bed, her gown shimmering in the dim light. Her movements were slow and deliberate, her arms outstretched as she began to dance. She twirled gracefully, her dark hair flowing like a shadow around her face, but her eyes, those hollow, black eyes, never left mine. I tried to scream, but no sound came out. My throat tightened and I felt as though I were suffocating. Xenia moved closer, her smile widening, revealing those sharp, jagged teeth. She raised her hand, the silver knife, glinting in the moonlight. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't escape. And then, just as the blade touched my skin, she vanished. The room was silent again, the music had stopped. I gasped for air, my heart pounding in my chest. I looked around frantically, but there was no sign of her. Just the darkness and the stillness of the night. I grabbed my phone and called the only person I knew would believe me, Maya, my best friend and a fellow journalist. She had always been fascinated by the paranormal, and if anyone could help me, it was her. "Maya, you need to come over," I whispered, my voice trembling. "Something's wrong." I saw her again. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When she finally spoke, her voice was calm but serious. "I'll be there in 20 minutes, don't move." Maya arrived at my apartment in record time, her eyes wide with concern as I opened the door. She was a tall, confident woman with short, choppy hair and a no-nonsense attitude. Normally her presence calmed me, but tonight nothing could shake the terror that gripped me. "I believe you," she said as soon as she saw the look on my face, "but we need to figure out what's going on before it gets worse." We spent the next few hours piecing together everything I had learned about Xenia. Maya had done her own research and found even more disturbing details about the dancer's past. According to some old diaries and letters she had uncovered, Xenia had been involved in a secret society tied to dark rituals. They believed in using music to summon spirits, and Xenia had been their most devout follower. The waltz she had danced wasn't just any waltz, it was a ritualistic dance meant to open a doorway to the afterlife, and it seemed somehow that doorway had never closed. "I think Xenia's trapped," Maya said, her brow furrowed as she flipped through the pages of an old journal. "She's stuck between worlds, reliving her final moments over and over, but there's more. Every time someone sees her, the ritual strengthens. She's feeding off the fear." I swallowed hard. "What does that mean for me?" Maya looked up, her expression grim. "It means she's attached to you now. She won't stop until she finishes the ritual." The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I was Xenia's next victim, her next pawn in whatever twisted game she was playing. But I wasn't going to let her win, not without a fight. Determined to end this nightmare once and for all, Maya and I decided to return to the alley where I had first seen Xenia. If the ritual had started there, maybe we could stop it there too. We packed up our equipment, cameras, flashlights, and an old book of rituals Maya had found in her research and headed out into the night. The streets of Belgrave were eerily quiet as we made our way to the alley. The streetlight flickered as we approached, casing long distorted shadows on the walls. I felt a chill run down my spine as we stepped into the alley, the same alley where I had encountered Xenia just nights before. Maya set up the camera, her hand steady despite the tension in the air. "We're going to try something different tonight," she said, her voice low. "If the ritual is what's keeping her here, maybe we can reverse it. But it's risky." I nodded, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't care about the risk anymore. I just wanted this to be over. We began the ritual, chanting the words from the old book in unison. The air around us grew colder, the wind picking up as the shadows seemed to deepen. And then, just as before, the music started. Xenia appeared. She danced toward us, her movements slow and deliberate, her eyes locked onto mine. The knife gleamed in her hand as she twirled closer and closer. My breath caught in my throat as I watched her, frozen in place. Maya continued chanting, her voice growing louder and more urgent. The ground beneath us seemed to tremble as Xenia stopped in front of me, her black eyes piercing into my soul. For a moment, everything was still. And then, with a deafening roar, the shadows around us exploded. Xenia screamed, her voice filled with rage and despair as the shadows engulfed her, pulling her back into the darkness. The music stopped, the wind died down, and the alley fell silent once more. It was over. I collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. Maya rushed to my side, her face pale but relieved. "We did it," she whispered, her voice shaking. We stopped her. But as we walked back to the car, the memory of Xenia's eyes lingered in my mind. I couldn't shake the feeling that, somewhere in the darkness, she was still watching, still waiting. Story 2. There is a small town called Arles Creek, nestled deep within the Appalachian Mountains, that no one ever visits. It's not marked on modern maps, and its existence is known only through whispers exchanged by the few locals in nearby areas. Most of the roads leading there have long been overtaken by the relentless wilderness. But those who still remember the town's eerie past tell a story that makes the blood of even the most skeptical listener run cold. They talk about the Whispering Woods, a forest dense with trees that seem to hum with secrets buried in the soil, trapped in the bark, and held in the roots of trees that grow unnaturally tall and twisted. Arles Creek wasn't always a ghost town. Decades ago, it was like any other mountain village, small, peaceful, and isolated. The townspeople lived quiet lives, mainly relying on hunting, farming, and each other. But then something changed. People began to disappear. At first it was blamed on natural dangers, wild animals, accidents in the treacherous mountains. But the more it happened, the harder it became to ignore that something far more sinister was at play. The disappearances always happened near the woods, a stretch of land the locals had long regarded with superstition. Old folk tales had warned against wandering too deep into the forest, but no one paid them much mind until it was too late. By the time the town had lost its 12th resident, they could no longer dismiss the whispers that something evil lurked within the Whispering Woods. Isaac Thornton didn't believe in ghost stories. As a journalist specializing in urban legends and unsolved mysteries, he had spent years chasing down the supernatural and had yet to encounter anything he couldn't explain. When he first heard about Arles Creek from a friend, a fellow writer who swore by the town's haunted reputation, he was intrigued but unconvinced. A ghost town in the middle of the mountains, a forest that whispered, and a string of unexplained disappearances. It sounded too perfect, like a cliché come to life. But it was the kind of story that people loved to read about, and Isaac couldn't resist the allure of a new challenge. He packed his bags and set out for Arles Creek, determined to debunk the mystery once and for all. The drive into the mountains was long and winding, the roads growing narrower and more treacherous the further he went. The trees seemed to close in on him from both sides, their branches forming a dense canopy that blocked out the sun. The air grew colder, and a heavy fog began to roll in, obscuring the path ahead. Isaac glanced at his GPS, which had already lost signal hours ago. He was going off nothing but old maps and vague directions scribbled in his notebook. Eventually, the road became so narrow that his car could barely squeeze through. The trees were impossibly tall now, their trunks gnarled and twisted in ways that made them look ancient and unnatural. Isaac had the unsettling feeling that they were watching him, their branches swaying ever so slightly despite the stillness of the air. He shook his head, dismissing the thought. It was just his imagination, heightened by the creepy atmosphere. Finally, he arrived at what he assumed was the edge of Arles Creek. The town lay in ruins, its buildings half collapsed and overgrown with vines and moss. There were no signs of life, not even the chirping of birds or the rustle of small animals. The place felt frozen in time, as if it had been abandoned in a hurry and left to rot. Isaac parked his car and stepped out, his boots crunching on the gravel road. The silence was unnerving. He pulled out his camera and began snapping photos of the decaying buildings, making mental notes for his article. He was already imagining the headline, "The Forgotten Ghost Town of Arles Creek," where the forest whispers secrets of the dead. After an hour of exploring the outskirts of the town, Isaac decided to venture into the woods. He had read about the Whispering Woods in old newspaper clippings and heard about them from the locals in the nearest town, but no one could or would tell him exactly what happened there. Some claimed it was cursed, others said it was haunted by the spirits of those who had gone missing. Whatever the case, Isaac knew the real story would be found in those woods. The entrance to the woods was marked by an old, rusted gate, half hidden by the overgrowth. A crude wooden sign hung from one of the posts, its letters faded but still legible, "Do not enter." Isaac smirked. Of course there would be a warning sign. Every good ghost story had one. He stepped over the gate, his flashlight cutting through the growing darkness. The trees here were even denser than they had been on the drive-in, their branches weaving together to form a thick canopy overhead. The air was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decaying leaves. There was something else too, a faint, metallic tang that he couldn't quite place. It made the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. The deeper he went, the more disorienting the forest became. The trees all looked the same, their trunks twisted and warped as if they had grown in agony. The ground was uneven, with roots jutting out at odd angles, making it difficult to walk without tripping. And then there was the silence. It was oppressive, almost deafening in its intensity. There were no animals, no wind, no sound at all, except for Isaac's own breathing and the occasional crunch of leaves underfoot. Isaac paused for a moment to catch his breath. He glanced at his watch. He had been walking for over an hour, but there was no sign of anything unusual, no ruins, no abandoned camps, no clues as to what might have happened to the people who disappeared. Just trees, stretching endlessly in every direction. But then, just as he was about to turn back, he heard it. A voice. At first he thought it was just the wind, but the air was still. The sound was faint, like a distant whisper, carried on a breeze that didn't exist. He strained to listen, trying to make out the words, but they were too soft, too garbled. It sounded like a woman's voice, but there was something off about it, something inhuman. Isaac's heart began to race. He fumbled for his camera, pointing it in the direction of the sound. The whispering grew louder, closer, but still indistinct. It seemed to be coming from all around him, echoing off the trees. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the whispering stopped. Isaac stood frozen, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The silence returned, thicker and more oppressive than before. He glanced around, his flashlight beam darting from tree to tree, but there was nothing. Just the trees and the darkness. He swallowed hard, trying to shake off the unease that had settled in his gut. It was just the wind, he told himself. Or maybe a trick of the mind. After all, he had been walking for hours in near darkness. It was only natural that his mind would start playing tricks on him. But as he turned to head back, he noticed something strange. The trees behind him where he had just walked seemed different. They were spaced more closely together, their trunks twisted and gnarled in ways that made them look almost like human figures, reaching out with long, spindly arms. Isaac's blood ran cold. He was sure the path hadn't looked like that when he had come in. He felt a sudden surge of panic. Had he gotten turned around? Was he lost? He pulled out his compass, hoping to orient himself, but the needle spun wildly, refusing to settle on any direction. He stared at it in disbelief, shaking it, but the result was the same. The compass was useless. Isaac's heart pounded in his chest. He couldn't be lost. He had been careful, marking his path mentally as he went. But now, standing there in the eerie silence of the woods, he realized just how disorienting the forest had become. He took a deep breath, trying to calm his nerves. Panic wouldn't help him now. He just needed to retrace his steps, stay focused, and find his way back to the car. But as he turned to leave, the whispering started again. This time it was louder. Clearer. And it was coming from right behind him. Isaac spun around, his flashlight cutting through the darkness, but there was no one there. Just trees, their twisted branches reaching out like skeletal arms. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, like a chorus of voices all speaking at once. He still couldn't make out the words, but the tone was unmistakable, pleading, desperate. "Who's there?" Isaac called out, his voice trembling despite his efforts to stay calm. "Is someone out there?" There was no response, just the relentless whispering. Isaac's heart raced as he scanned the trees, his flashlight darting from shadow to shadow. He took a cautious step forward, then another, his pulse pounding in his ears. The whispering seemed to be moving now, circling him, always just out of reach. He swallowed hard, his throat dry. His instinct screamed at him to run, but his journalistic curiosity kept him rooted to the spot. What was this? Some kind of trick? A natural phenomenon? He needed to know. Isaac gripped the flashlight tighter, his hands slick with sweat. The whispering seemed to be closing in, coming from everywhere and nowhere all at once. His breaths were shallow, coming in rapid, uneven bursts, as the eerie, disembodied voices continued their haunting symphony. The sound grew more intense, like they were right behind him, breathing down his neck. But there was nothing. No figures, no shadows, no movement, just the endless, twisted trees. Suddenly, the whispering stopped again. The silence hit Isaac like a physical blow, so deafening it was almost painful. He stood frozen in place, barely daring to breathe. His eyes darted around the dark forest, searching for any sign of life, any indication that he wasn't alone. For a moment everything was still, too still. Then, out of the corner of his eye, Isaac saw something. A flicker of movement among the trees. His heart skipped a beat as he swung the flashlight toward it, but the beam of light caught nothing but the gnarled bark of the nearest tree. The sense of being watched, however, remained palpable, a pressure in the air that pressed in on all sides. Isaac's pulse hammered in his ears. His mind raced with possibilities, hallucinations from exhaustion, tricks of the light, or maybe something far more disturbing. The rational part of him wanted to turn back, to retrace his steps and get out of the woods while he still could. But something deep within him urged him forward. The answers to the mystery were here, somewhere in this cursed forest. He took another step forward, cautiously. His flashlight flickered, as if struggling against an unseen force casting weak shadows over the ancient trees. Isaac's senses were on high alert, every crackle of leaves beneath his boots sending a jolt of fear through him. Then, out of the darkness came a voice, clear, distinct, and unmistakably human. "Help me." Isaac's blood froze in his veins. The voice was soft, weak, and filled with an overwhelming sense of despair. It was a woman's voice, but it carried an unnatural echo, as if it were being repeated by the forest itself. "Hello?" Isaac called out, his voice trembling with fear. "Who's there?" "Help me," the voice repeated, closer now. Isaac's heart raced as he spun around, scanning the trees. His flashlight flickered again, casting long, eerie shadows that twisted and contorted as if they had a life of their own. He took a few hesitant steps in the direction of the voice. "Where are you?" he asked, trying to sound calm, though his voice betrayed the fear coursing through him. Silence. Then, just as he was about to call out again, he saw it. A figure, barely visible in the dim light, standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight. It was a woman, or at least it appeared to be. She was dressed in a long, tattered dress, her hair hanging in matted strands over her face. Her skin was deathly pale, almost glowing in the darkness, and her arms hung limply at her sides. Isaac's heart thudded in his chest as he raised his flashlight to get a better look. The beam of light flickered, sputtered, then died completely, plunging him into total darkness. He cursed under his breath, frantically tapping the flashlight to bring it back to life. After a few desperate moments, the light flickered on again, but when he pointed it toward where the figure had been, she was gone. Isaac's hand shook as he scanned the area, but there was no sign of the woman. Only the trees, standing silent and unmoving, as if they had witnessed everything. "Damn it," he muttered to himself, his heart still racing. But then he heard it again, the whispering, faint at first, but growing louder by the second, until it felt like the voices were right next to him. He spun around, trying to pinpoint the source, but the sound seemed to come from everywhere at once surrounding him. His breaths came in ragged gasps as he stumbled backward, tripping over a root and nearly falling to the ground. He caught himself just in time, his pulse thundering in his ears. The whispering grew more intense, the voices overlapping in a cacophony of incoherent murmurs. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The silence was suffocating, pressing down on Isaac like a weight. He stood frozen, his body trembling, his mind racing. What the hell was going on? Before he could process what had happened, the woman's voice returned, louder this time. "Help me." Isaac's heart lurched in his chest. The voice was right behind him. He spun around, shining his flashlight into the darkness, and there she was, standing just a few feet away. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes hollow and sunken, and her lips barely moved as she whispered the words again, "Help me." Isaac opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. His throat felt tight, his body paralyzed with fear. The woman's eyes locked onto his, and for a brief moment he felt as though she was looking straight through him, her gaze piercing into his soul. "Please," she whispered, her voice cracking with desperation. And Isaac's mind screamed at him to run, but his feet remained glued to the spot. Something about the woman held him in place, an invisible force that compelled him to stay, to listen. Then, without warning, she reached out toward him, her hand pale and skeletal, her fingers trembling. Isaac flinched, instinctively stepping back, but the ground beneath his feet gave way. He stumbled, falling backward into the underbrush, his flashlight flying from his hand. As he hit the ground, pain shot through his back, but he barely registered it. The woman was gone. The air was deathly still again, the whispering silence. For a moment, all Isaac could do was lie there, staring up at the twisted branches overhead, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. But the moment of stillness didn't last long. A new sound reached his ears, soft at first, but steadily growing louder. Footsteps. Oh, Isaac's blood ran cold. The footsteps were slow, deliberate, and coming closer. He scrambled to his feet, his heart pounding in his chest, his breath coming in short, panicked bursts. He frantically searched the ground for his flashlight, but it was nowhere to be found. The footsteps grew louder, closer. Isaac's panic escalated as he backed away, his eyes darting around the dark forest. He could barely see anything now, the moonlight obscured by the thick canopy of trees. But the footsteps were unmistakable, closing in on him inch by inch. And then, just as they reached the edge of his hearing, they stopped. Isaac froze, his heart pounding so hard it felt like it might burst from his chest. The silence returned, thicker than before, suffocating him. He stood perfectly still, not daring to move, not daring to breathe. For what felt like an eternity, nothing happened. Then, from behind him, came a single blood-curdling whisper. "Run." Isaac didn't need to be told twice. He spun around and bolted through the trees, his feet pounding against the uneven ground, his lungs burning as he ran faster than he had ever run in his life. Branches whipped against his face and arms, roots and rocks tripped him up, but he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The whispering returned, louder now, chasing him through the woods like a swarm of angry bees. The voices overlapped, growing more frantic, more desperate, until they became a deafening roar in his ears. "Run, run, run." Isaac's legs burned, his body screaming in protest, but he kept going. He didn't know where he was running to, only that he had to get away. Away from the whispers, away from the footsteps, away from whatever haunted this cursed forest. But no matter how fast he ran, the whispers followed. The forest itself seemed to twist and shift around him, the trees closing in, the path disappearing beneath his feet. He was hopelessly lost. And then, just as his body was about to give out, he saw it, a light flickering in the distance through the trees. It was faint but unmistakable. The car. Where Isaac's heart leaped in his chest as he pushed himself harder, sprinted toward the light with everything he had left. The whispers grew louder, more frantic, as if they were trying to stop him, to pull him back. But Isaac didn't look back. He couldn't. He burst through the last of the trees and stumbled into the clearing where his car was parked. His legs gave out beneath him, and he collapsed to the ground, gasping for air. The whispering stopped the moment he crossed the threshold of the forest, as if the trees themselves had given up the chase. Isaac lay there for a moment, too exhausted to move, his body trembling with fear and adrenaline. But the silence was back, heavy and oppressive, as though the forest was watching, waiting. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Isaac forced himself to his feet. His body ached. His clothes were torn and bloodied from the branches, but he didn't care. All that mattered was getting out of there. He staggered to his car, fumbling with the keys in his trembling hands. After what felt like an eternity, he managed to unlock the door and climb inside. He slammed the door shut, locking it. As the weeks turned into months, Isaac settled back into his routine, but life had changed in profound ways. The haunting presence of the forest lingered in his mind, but it no longer filled him with dread. Instead, it fueled his desire to share the story of Eleanor and the other souls he had freed. He began documenting his experiences in a journal, capturing every detail, every emotion, every whisper that had once plagued him. His newfound passion led him to start a blog dedicated to local legends and ghost stories. Each post delved into the history of the town, the tragedies that had shaped it, and the spirits that lingered in its shadows. The response was overwhelming. People in the community began to share their own encounters, their own tales of loss and redemption, weaving a tapestry of collective memory that connected them all. Isaac quickly became a local figure, known not only for his storytelling but also for his compassion. He organized community events, inviting people to share their stories around bonfires in the very forest that had once terrified him. Each gathering served as a reminder of the past, a celebration of the lives that had shaped their town, and a commitment to honoring those who had suffered. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting a warm glow over the gathering, Isaac felt a sense of peace wash over him. Surrounded by friends and strangers alike, he listened to their stories of lost loved ones, of memories cherished, and of encounters that defied explanation. Each voice added depth to the community's collective memory, and he knew that together they were healing wounds that had festered for too long. Among the stories shared that night, one particularly resonated with Isaac. A woman named Clara spoke of her brother, who had disappeared in the woods decades ago. Tears glistened in her eyes as she recounted the pain of loss and the yearning to know what had happened to him. The crowd fell silent, captivated by her vulnerability. Isaac felt a surge of empathy. He approached Clara after the gathering, determined to help her find answers. "I know what it's like to lose someone," he said gently. "If you'd like, I can help you search the forest again. Maybe we can find something, anything that could give you closure." Clara looked at him, hope mingling with skepticism. "You think we can find him? After all this time, I believe we can find a piece of him. We can honor his memory together." That following weekend, they ventured back into the forest, a group of friends accompanying them for support. The atmosphere was different now, transformed by the light of friendship and shared purpose. Isaac led the way, guiding them to the clearing where he had encountered Eleanor, the place that had birthed his own transformation. As they arrived, Clara began to recount stories of her brother, painting a vivid picture of his laughter, his dreams, and the love that still filled her heart. The others listened intently, some sharing their own stories of loss, creating a circle of connection that bridged their grief. Isaac felt the energy shift around them, a palpable sense of respect for the memories being honored. He brought out the candles and sage just as he had before, and they formed a circle, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows on the trees. "Let's call out his name," Isaac suggested. Feeling the weight of the moment, "Let's honor him just as I did for Eleanor." Clara nodded, her voice trembling. "His name was Daniel?" As they spoke Daniel's name, a hush fell over the forest. The air thickened, the whispers returning, a soft breeze rustling through the leaves as if the forest itself was responding. Isaac closed his eyes, focusing on the connection they were forging, the bond that stretched across time and space. "Daniel," he whispered, "we're here to remember you. You are not forgotten." In that moment, a rustle in the underbrush caught their attention. The group turned, hearts racing, as a shadow moved through the trees. Isaac's breath caught in his throat, and he felt a familiar chill sweep over him. Could it be? But as quickly as it had appeared, the shadow disappeared, leaving only the soft sigh of the wind behind. The group stood in stunned silence, and St. Isaac sensed the weight of their collective hope. "Did you see that?" Clara gasped, her eyes wide. "Was that him?" Siak couldn't say for sure. The moment had been fleeting, but he felt a shift in the atmosphere, a sense that they had touched something deeper than mere memories. "I think he's here with us," Isaac said softly. "Even if we didn't find him in body, he's felt in spirit. You've honored him today, and I believe he knows that." The group spent hours sharing stories, laughter, and tears, a cathartic release that bound them closer together. As darkness enveloped the forest, they lit the candles, creating a beacon of light amid the shadows. In the flickering glow, Clara felt a weight lift from her heart. "Thank you," she whispered to Isaac, "for helping me remember him, for helping me honor his memory." Isaac smiled, feeling a sense of purpose wash over him. This was why he had faced the darkness, that connection, that healing. As they left the forest that night, Clara held on to the hope that her brother's spirit was free, at peace among the trees. The whispers of the forest no longer felt haunting. They were now a melody of stories, a reminder of the lives that intertwined within its depths. Inspired by the healing they had experienced, Isaac decided to take his work further. We'd organized a storytelling festival in the town, inviting locals to share their tales of loss, love, and redemption. The event became an annual tradition, drawing people from neighboring towns, each person contributing their stories, creating a tapestry of history and healing. The forest that had once been a place of terror transformed into a sanctuary of remembrance. Isaac often led groups back into the woods, guiding them through the process of honoring their loved ones, encouraging them to speak their names and share their memories. One day, as he stood at the edge of the clearing, watching a new group of seekers share their stories, he felt a familiar presence beside him. Clara stood there, her eyes sparkling with gratitude. I can't believe how far we've come," she said, her voice filled with emotion. "Neither can I," Isaac replied, feeling a swell of pride. "It's all about connection. The more we share, the more we heal." Clara nodded, her heart full. "Thank you for showing me the way. You've changed my life." Isaac smiled, knowing that their journey together had only just begun. He would continue to weave the stories of the lost and the living, ensuring that no one would ever feel alone in their grief again. Years passed, and Isaac became known not only as a storyteller but also as a healer, a guardian of memories. He dedicated his life to preserving the tales of the past, honoring those who had suffered, and creating a community that embraced their shared humanity. The whispers of the forest remained, but now they were a symphony of stories echoing through the trees and carrying the names of those who had come before. And so, as Isaac walked through the woods, he felt the warmth of their presence, the knowledge that he had found his purpose among the shadows. The forest had been both a nightmare and a sanctuary, and he had learned that within the darkness there is always light, a light that can guide you home.